Just a quick announcement before I hand it over to our guest speaker. We gave feedback to everybody's final project. So if you submitted your final project idea on La Lima, we have commented on it and either said, yeah, it's great, or yeah, it's great, but, or we said something else. But yeah, most of them were wonderful, and I can't wait to see all those final projects. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Dr. Gordon Bennett. Dr. Bennett is a new faculty member in PEPS. He's a bug expert. He did his PhD on Hawaiian bugs at Berkeley with Patrick O'Grady, and then moved to a postdoc with Nancy Moran, first at Yale and then at Texas before landing right back here in Hawaii. And he's going to tell us all about some of the fascinating Hawaiian insects that he studies.
Yes. All right, well, thanks for the chance to share this work. A lot of this comes from my PhD work that I finished up a couple years ago. But I'm also going to take the opportunity to sort of give you a broader view of insect natural history in Hawaii. And then I'm going to sort of go more deeply into the work I did just to give you an idea of how the Hawaiian Islands and the ecology of the islands actually conspired to form these really amazing groups. Can everybody hear me okay? I've never spoken in this room before, so. Okay, so for people who give Hawaiian talks, it's usually obligatory to extol the values of Hawaii and why it's such a great place to do research and to get projects going. And I'm sure you've heard a little bit about the geology, but I thought I would just start out recontextualizing how we think about this problem and doing evolutionary studies in Hawaii. And kind of the amazing thing is that Hawaii is the most isolated landmass on the planet. It's just hanging out there in the middle of the Pacific. And that turns out to be a really important driver and shaper of the native diversity here. And we have a really good idea of how these islands have formed over time on the scale of millions of years. And Hawaiian Islands have sort of just percolated up out of the middle of the Pacific over this hot spot where island forming and magma just sort of rose up and then spilled out, and islands became sort of subaerial land masses. And the whole plate is shifting northwest. You just have this long string of islands that have existed for the last 80 million years. And currently the islands that we most often think about, or if you're looking at vacation brochures, they talk about islands within the last 5 million years, Kauai being one of the oldest, and then the Big Island now, about 500,000 years. We have this pretty well worked out, which gives us a really nice context for studying things in Hawaii. And the islands themselves are kind of age sorted, where they go from almost 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And each time these islands formed, they tend to make these discrete geographic land masses that didn't exist until more recently. So Kauai being the oldest one that formed about 5 million years ago, and then as I was saying earlier, Hawaii being the newest one, that's roughly about 500,000 years old. But some of the eastern flanks are in the tens of thousands of years old, which is really recent on ecological and evolutionary time frame. And the Hawaiian Islands have been forming for 80 million years, like I said, but what's really cool about this is at periods, there were really no islands. So there was kind of this clearing event with whatever had gotten to the Hawaiian Islands was sort of just slated off. And that happened right prior also to what we have now with Kauai going through the Big Island. And in that time frame, basically almost all the lineages except for a few arrived and colonized in the last 5 million years. I'm going to talk about a few exceptions briefly, but a lot of what you find in the native environment here is pretty young and pretty new on an evolutionary time frame. And Hawaii itself, if you have had the chance to travel through the islands, is exceptionally diverse and encompasses a good number of the biomes that the environment has. I think it's 13 out of 15 or a statistic or something like that, where we have subalpine regions that kind of give you the idea of being up in Alaska somewhere. They have intense coastal areas that are very dry, and they also have extreme wet forests. This is in West Maui, which has some of the prettiest wet forests, rainforests I've ever seen. And then they also have these sort of drier forests where a lot of the plants are sort of adapted to more drier climates. So diversity across the ecological landscape is really profound, and it's really pretty amazing. And then the islands themselves are kind of comprised as islands, what we call islands within the islands, because that's geologic erosion has sort of taken hold of these islands. It's really stripped them into these really amazing valleys and precipices that tend to get their own species and really shape how populations can correlate with each other and breed. And this is West Valley. I don't know if anyone's taken these single prop airplane rides across the Hawaiian Islands, but they're absolutely terrifying. You do get beautiful pictures, but you also feel like you're going to maybe not make it. But this was a really awesome trip that we had to Molokai flying through West Mountain. Yeah.
These prop planes are fully enclosed cockpits, right?
They're fully enclosed, but they seat you in order of weight, and you have to get on a scale before you get on the plane, and then they put your luggage in somewhere. And then the planes kind of just, they're subject to the winds. They don't fly very high. Oh, okay. Yeah, they're enclosed, so I think it's safe, but it's enclosed. So the islands, not only are they islands, but within the islands there's such topographic diversity, we consider it to be islands within islands. And that becomes really important in shaping the natural history here. As a result, I focus on the insects, but the plant insect fauna here is almost all native, except for the introductions that have happened in recent human time. The insects are 99% native, so if you run out into the forest, I'm not talking about going to a cornfield or your yard, most of the insects that make up the fauna here are native. And then the plants are about 89% native. And that's changing slowly as more introductions get going with human activity. But the take home is that Hawaii has its own insect and plant diversity. And some of these groups are really pretty amazing. My former advisor studied the Hawaiian Drosophila, and this is one of the most speciose, or one of the species-rich fly radiations that has occurred on the planet. And it comprises over 1,000 species that are diversified across the whole islands. Just to give you an idea of what they do when they actually diversify here, this is kind of a Drosophila that you would find maybe in your kitchen that's introduced, made of just regular fruit fly type melanogaster. But the rest of these are all Hawaiian Drosophila, and they turn into these big, sort of robust, colorful, speckled flies. So they're kind of a far cry from what they might have been when they first arrived. But then they've also adapted all these really dramatic courtships. So when they're actually interacting with each other, they do all sorts of things like they fight. You can think of rhinoceroses that might fight for a female. Drosophila do that. They fight in different ways, and different species have adapted different ways of attracting females by fighting off other males. They also give gifts of sort of nutrients to females. This is a really unique and pretty amazing adaptation, where they give a sort of a drip of amino acids and other proteins that females might benefit from if they start to produce offspring. And then they just intimidate each other too. So they kind of replicate a lot of things that you'd see in the natural environment, more on the scale of what you think of maybe mammals doing. The flies are doing that here too, which is a very unique thing and pretty amazing. Another really interesting part about the Drosophila, they are probably the most diverse insect group here. About half of them are described, and they estimate 1,000 species, but they're really ancient. So very few insect groups precede this sort of 5 million year. I know this is kind of a complicated diagram I got from my former advisor, but this is the time scale going back to all the islands. These are the islands as they overlap as we go forward in time. These blue bars are periods when the islands were basically gone, and the geologic landscape or substrate for things to survive have been wiped off. The Drosophila managed to make it through all these bottlenecks, partly because they're allied with some of the oldest plant groups on the Hawaiian Islands. You might hear more about this, but the Campanulaceae, this is one of the older plant groups that's known from the Hawaiian Islands, probably arrived about 13 to 15 million years ago. The Drosophila, this is a dominant host plant for them, and that sort of arrived here, and they just sort of managed to pass through these bottlenecks as islands eroded away. So they would have been small little atolls or kind of crummy little rock outcroppings, but somehow the Drosophila managed to hang on. And they've been here probably since 25 million years ago, and a lot of studies have sort of arrived at that. So they're the oldest, they're the most diverse, and it's partly because they survived island erosion. And if you have any questions, feel free to just interrupt. Another major group that's studied here on campus is the Hapa's Makoma, and a guy named Dan Rubinoff studies this. group, and they comprise at least 400 species, so it's another one of those larger adaptive radiations in the Hawaiian Islands. And they form these really amazing cases, and these cases, each species has a different color, different substrate type that it uses to make these cases. And then when they pupate and they become moths, these are moths, they're not quite as spectacular as their larva stage. But they have also done these really amazing things where some of the caterpillars have become aquatic, where they feed in the water and they dive. And they spend half their lifetime just sort of diving down to feed on algae and stuff in the bottom of streams, in the Hawaiian streams. And then other ones have actually adapted to prey on the caterpillars. And this is unusual. This is not something that commonly happens for moth larvae. And this is another group that probably survived since about 15 million years ago and also made it through the sort of erosion of the Hawaiian Islands. And it's not just the insects that have been benefiting from the Hawaiian Islands and diversifying. The spider fauna here is also exceptionally diverse. And this has been one of the sort of the iconic study systems for adaptive radiations. And the genus Tetragnatha basically has evolved on different islands to look exactly, or to have the same color as the plants that it hangs out on to capture insects. And then the more iconic happy-faced spider, which I'm sure some of you probably have seen, one of the most picturesque, best-known insects from Hawaii across the continent. Yeah.
Are any of these spiders poisonous, or if they bite you, you would need medical attention?
None of the native ones are poisonous that you need medical attention. I should back up and state that a lot of the times what happens with these insects when they arrive on Hawaii is they lose a lot of their defenses because there's not a lot of competition and there's not a lot of major things that are preying on them that they need to keep these really complex defense mechanisms. Tetragnatha and the happy-faced spiders, their relatives aren't poisonous, but there are some introduced spiders that, like black widows are here, been introduced, they can be poisonous. But the native ones are not. And they are sort of doing this adaptive radiation thing that other insects are doing. And these are exceptionally diverse. There's hundreds of species of spiders here. And these are just two groups that have gotten a lot of attention recently. And I just wanted to sort of conclude this broad overview with a final piece. These are crab beetles that are associated with trees. The genus is Mecyclothorax, and a colleague of mine has been working on these over the last few years. And what's really exceptional about these is that there's well over 400 species, but just in the last year, just from East Maui, this is Haleakala area, described over about 110 species. So what we know and what we've documented here is really kind of just a piece of the pie. Although some people have been working on these groups like the Drosophila, where we think there's 1,000, only half of them are described, so we don't really know. And in this case, with the Mecyclothorax beetles, just in the last sort of 3 years, our colleagues have described over 200. So there's a huge gap in our knowledge of what's out there. And it just kind of is dependent on people's interests and how much effort they put into some of these groups and documenting these species. And that goes for other groups that feed on plants, which I'm going to sort of skip into now. These are true bugs in the Hemiptera group. And this is derived from one origin. You can just see the amazing sort of color morphology and diversity that they've acquired over time. And this basically associates with the different plants that they feed on. So these reddish ones tend to feed on a plant called Myrcine that has a reddish sort of meristem. And they hide there. And these other ones are feeding on greener plants, sort of more open environments. And these darker ones are in the rainforest. And there's hundreds of these true bugs, these hemipteroid species here. But just 20 or 30 of them have been described. So just a profound diversity that's unknown. And Hawaii has also produced a lot of oddities aside from the ones I've already described, where if you go to the Big Island, there's a lot of caves that exist. They exist throughout the islands, but when lava is forming the islands themselves, they tend to make these things called lava tubes. And so there's really complex and ancient cave systems in Hawaii. And there's been a lot of cave adaptation in insects that don't always or normally make cave adapted insects, such as this cricket here, which is totally blind. Crickets normally sing, but in this case they don't sing. There's the centipedes. Has anybody ever been bitten by these things in the not this one, but the one that's kind of running around people's houses. Yeah, great people. In caves, there's a relative that's adapted to it that's kind of just emaciated, doesn't bite, just hangs out, feeds in the caves. But then also there's plant-feeding insects that have adapted to caves. So this is the sister species of this one. This is a cave-adapted one. It's basically lost all its traits for the open environment, and it feeds on roots. And it's also blind, and it's lost its wings because you don't need that stuff in a cave. So this kind of thing is going on in Hawaii all the time. Another thing is that a lot of things have lost the flight ability. So this is a flightless moth, and then this is a crane fly that's lost its wings, and in this common pattern in other groups. And we think that the adaptation here is because the Hawaiian Islands, if you're on, say you're on the mainland US, if you get caught in the wind, you just get deposited somewhere else where you can probably survive and find food. But if you're in the Hawaiian Islands and you get swept up by the winds, it's a good chance you're just gonna end up in the middle of the ocean. So you can think that, we tend to think that the winds put selection on these insects to lose flight adaptation, or not to fly, because if you get sucked in the wind, you're done. You're not gonna pass on any genes or have any offspring. So there's actually representatives in almost all the insect groups, or very many of them, that have lost flight. So that's kind of a World War tour of sort of the most spectacular radiations that have taken place on the Hawaiian Islands. But Hawaii, like I was saying, it's really just this great place to study evolution, or just to understand how things sort of conspire to shape diversity in the natural environment. And this is kind of what drew me to it in the first place when I was getting my PhD started. I had met some people that were working on Drosophila, and they told me about this really cool place where you have this geologic and ecological construct that you can ask basically any question you want. And I got really interested in plant and insect interactions, and I started looking through the literature to find a group worth studying. And there were very many, because there were very many gaps in what we know. And the questions I had sort of come up with was, well, what's driving species diversification? And then how do ecology and geography play together in this? And that's what Hawaii is good for. The group I picked to work on is this endemic Hawaiian leafhopper genus. It's called Nisoprasini, but I'm not going to sort of bore you with taxonomic details too much. But they're this sap-feeding group. They're associated with the native plants here in Hawaii, to the point where one species feeds on one species of host plant. So very highly restricted ecologically. And it's really kind of neat because when you're out studying these things in the native environment, you stop looking for the insects and you're actually just looking for plants. So it became more of a botany project after a while. There's over 200 species of these that have been identified through my work and some work that other people have done. And it's the only leafhopper radiation on Hawaii. There's a couple other really small groups that maybe have 10 species. But in this case, nothing has quite done what this has done. And I'm going to talk to you about sort of how these things have evolved and where they came from and what happened. But just to give you an idea, these are highly specialized plant-feeding insects where they have a straw-like or piercing mouthpart where they feed on phloem of the native plants here. So they find the vascular system of the plant, they pierce it, and they feed on that. And that's all they can eat, essentially. So the Nisoprasini themselves, they're exceptionally diverse. You can find them from the coast all the way up to subalpine regions. If you go out to the crater of Haleakala, there are species that have reduced wings, and they have really thick cuticles, and they're about half the size of the other species. So they've adapted to exist in a windswept, dry environment. But they also are on the coasts and then in the rainforests and basically any environment here except where nothing can live, these have adapted to occur, as long as there's a plant there. And they feed on basically 75% of the most dominant plants here. So they've really exploited plants, and that's their sort of MO. And some of the questions that I kind of want to answer for you today are what the diversity of these species are, what the age and the origins are, and then sort of how these species diversify, what drove their diversification. So I gave you a broad brush of some of the patterns we looked at, but I kind of want to dive a little bit lower to give you an idea of what actually happens, what's the nuts and bolts of natural history here and what forms it in Hawaii. And you can do that in Hawaii because it's discrete. If you have enough time and money on your hands, you can hop from each of the islands and document the insects that exist. As long as you have someone who's able to identify the plants and the insects, So it's a good chance for a PhD study if you have 5 or 6 years on hand to just hang out and collect and identify insects. And that's exactly what I did for about 6.5 years. So it was quite a long PhD, lots of time here. So after we got done doing massive collections across the islands, we assembled this into a phylogeny. Do people have a background understanding phylogenies or what they are? Do I need to explain that or a little bit? So what we do is we collected all the species that we could. This is just a subset of them. And we extracted their DNA and we sequenced them for a number of genes. And then when we get the genes for each species, we looked at how closely related the genes are, and that gives us an idea of how closely related each of these species are to each other. And that's a real simplification of the process. Then we end up with this phylogenetic tree structure where we can say, okay, all these species here in this group are closely related. Maybe they share some sort of ancestry or there's something about them. But we know that they're the sister species of each other. And then we did this for all the Hawaiian Drosophila species for about 5 genes that we sequenced, and that's about 5,000 base pairs out of a genome. It's not a huge fraction, it's really small actually. But about 3 or 4 years ago, that was pretty good. Now people tend to go for the whole genome or big chunks of it. So it's a bit dated at this point. Nonetheless, when we put this tree together, we also included leafhoppers from around the world. Because what you want to do, ask the question is, okay, did these Drosophila arrive at one point in Hawaii? Are they all related to each other? Or did they come from multiple places and arrive in Hawaii? The phylogeny allows us to answer questions like that. And then it also allows us to answer a lot of downstream questions. In the case of these Drosophila, we got really great support that they arrived one time. So they showed up here and then got busy diversifying and doing a lot of different things across the landscape. And this is just some of the outcome of that process. But we can take the phylogeny now and ask really important questions about how geography shaped the diversification of these branches, how host plants and other ecological traits shape the diversification of those branches. Does that make sense? Okay. If you have any questions, just stop. I'm going to gloss over some pretty intense statistical stuff that I just sort of cut out. So what it turns out after we got done assembling this phylogeny is that species are exceptionally restricted. So even though we have the whole Hawaiian Islands, there's islands among themselves. As I was saying, there are islands within islands. All these little color pattern areas tend to have their own species groups. So species don't really span a whole island. They're restricted to single volcanoes. So as these volcanoes emerge, species colonized them and then speciated there. So each volcano has unique sets of species. And that's really important for conservation planning because if you're going to do some sort of an effort to save endangered or native species, you have to think about the fact that what's here is not the same as what's here. And even on Oahu, if you think of Oahu where we are now, you have the Ko'olau range and the Waianae range. These are unique from these. So very unique species that have diversified across the different volcanoes. And these are just sort of species estimates that we got for each of the islands, and the biggest one having nearly 60 species. These are almost certainly underestimates. And there's been a lot of extinction because a lot of historical collections were from places that are now sort of parking malls and housing lots. So a lot of things have been lost in the process. But this gives us a good idea of what's out there. And what else is really cool, the species tend to be cryptic. So cryptic species are species that look exactly the same in different environments or in the same environment, but they're genetically divergent. So in this case, they're almost 10% divergent. And usually we use a 5% cutoff to say, oh, these are unique species. But if you go around the Big Island, for an example, species tend to look the same on each of the volcanoes morphologically. So if you just looked at them picture-wise, you wouldn't be able to distinguish them. But if you look at the genetics of it, they're highly divergent, which means they're not really traveling between the volcanoes. They're having the same ecological associations, and they tend to look the same, but they're not migrating and connecting populations. So each volcano has its own species. And it turns out that the actual communities themselves get replicated. So you'll have 3 to 5 species on this island, and the same, the sister species on the next volcano are like a carbon copy of that. Historically, what people often fail to appreciate is that cryptic species are really common in Hawaii, even though you have things that look the same and they will co-occur across volcanoes or different islands. People tend to describe them as one thing, but that's actually not the case. And a lot of people are starting to find now that cryptic species are really high in abundance. And that's another important conservation note, because when you go to say the species, or if you're trying to say the habitat, you have to make sure you understand that it's a unique thing that you're going for. So that's the species diversity. It's really complex and it's hidden. Because there's a lot of cryptic species diversity, it's a hidden diversity that we weren't able to find until we actually got the genetics going. But the next question that a lot of people ask when you're studying Hawaiian groups is, well, where do they come from and how old are they? Since we know the Hawaiian island ages, we can start to approach that question pretty easily. But it gets kind of complicated because when things arrive in Hawaii, they can come from anywhere around the Pacific basin. So I made a lot of friends with people and asked them to sort of cough up species from different genera that might be closely related to the one that's here in Hawaii. And using the same phylogenetic process, we sequenced a bunch of their genes, and then we compared them to the ones that we have from Hawaii. And it turns out that the Drosophila here in Hawaii arrived from the Western Pacific. So we made this leap. The closest ones we have are from this genus Erosius in Australia, but this is a widespread pest genus that occurs all over the Western Pacific. And it's a very capable flyer, and it's kind of logical that that might be one that would arrive here because they have really wide ranges, they fly very far, and they feed on a lot of different plants. So the species in this genus are what's called polyphagous, and they can feed on very many things. So if they arrived in Hawaii and there were just a handful of plants, they'd be adapted probably to feed on, or to even find them. And then we used the molecular data to actually get an idea of how old Drosophila is. And we estimated that it arrived about 3.5 million years ago. So Kauai is 5 million years, 5 million years old, but this genus arrived a little bit afterwards. So if you remember, prior to Kauai, the Hawaiian Islands were sort of laid low, and they lost a lot of their plant diversity. And then basically what we had about 3.5 million years ago was Kauai was finished forming, and West Oahu was kind of a molten slag. If you've been to the Big Island now, and you go to Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, and I'm talking about where the volcanoes are actually erupting, that's probably what was going on at Oahu. So Hawaii was the highest, most ecologically mature landmass at that time period. So if you're a plant feeder and you arrive in Hawaii, it makes sense that this is what you would find, and then you also probably wouldn't come right at 5 million years because Hawaii needed time to build up its plant fauna, or flora. So that's why we think about 3.5 million years is probably correlated with plant diversity accumulating on Hawaii. And I should also mention that this is just an average estimate. There's really wide error bars around this, so it could have been quite a bit older, and it could have been a bit younger. But that's just a methodological consideration. So I guess I left a few notes on my slides. Apologize about that. This was from a previous talk, and I put it back in because one thing we talked a lot about when I was doing my PhD is, sorry, that's very distracting. When we do our PhD is, what are the sort of climatological mechanisms for things arriving here? And so people actually spend a lot of time thinking about this and looking at wind patterns, and then also the Pacific gyre and sort of water circulation patterns. And they estimated that if you were arriving by wind, it would only take you 2 to 4 days as a flighted insect. So that's not very long. If you go 2 days without food as an insect, you can survive. You can survive for quite a while. So we tend to think that these insects probably arrived by wind. If you are an insect that feeds on plants or sap, you came by water, estimated maybe about a month. And that's a little bit too long biologically to go without food or any plant material. And back in the day when entomology had a lot more money, people used to just fly planes around in the air just to see what they could scoop out. And this kind of dramatic paper, which is really kind of fun to read, was all based on flying this rig around at about 3,000 to 7,000 feet collecting insects. And they found a number of leafhoppers about 7,000 feet, which is getting up towards where some of the air currents can actually drive insects here. So it seems likely that they were wind dispersed, and there's a collection of evidence for that from other systems. Although we don't know for certain, but that's our hypothesis. Nobody does that anymore, as far as I know. So then, what are the patterns of diversification? So how have things come together to give us this sort of diversity of insects? As I mentioned, they arrived in Kauai, and once they got there, they just started to diversify on the land map. So this is just a topographical map of Kauai. And again, that was basically all there was there, and that's all they had to work with in terms of where they could diversify and find plants. As I said, that's all there was. None of this existed, so the species just sort of started to adapt to the environment there. But once they did that, once they started to diversify and the islands themselves cropped up and started to form, they left Kauai pretty quickly. And they went and descended down the islands as they formed. And we call this the progression rule. And that's kind of a null hypothesis for how things have spread through Hawaii. So basically, they get started on Kauai, then they go to Oahu once it forms, then to Maui once it forms, and then to Hawaii once it forms. And looking at the phylogeny, this is exactly what Drosophila has done. And each time these lineages arrived on an island, they diversified within that island and then spread on. And there are about 30 different lineages that went and did this in parallel. And there's some really cool ecological reasons for why these lineages stayed apart and then were able to descend down the islands, and I'll talk about that in a second. There are several major exceptions, though, where it looks like lineages originated on a younger island and then spread back up the island or went down to younger islands. So that is kind of a rejection of the progression rule. And there are some reasons for this, too, that are really kind of neat. So the ecology, getting into the host plant stuff, this is kind of where I was really interested. I wanted to see what was happening. And this was the most difficult part of the project because I had to basically convert to a botanist as best I could in the meantime. So I stopped studying the insects so much and started paying attention to the plants. And it turns out that this is the phylogeny here, that the major clades in these Drosophila are associated exclusively with particular host plants, or host plant groups. As I said earlier, species are restricted. One species feeds on one host plant, and these host plant species diversified along with their with the insects and the plants. So these are just a few of the dominant ones. I'm not sure if you've had a lot of talks about other plant groups here in Hawaii, but I won't force you to memorize, or I won't go through these plant names, but these are all major dominant plant radiations on Hawaii that were available to Drosophila to feed on. And it basically organized all the species diversity on the phylogeny. And the dominant ones are in the rubiaceae, just to give you sort of a broad idea of all the different plant families. The dominant plant groups are the Rubiaceae and the Urticaceae. So the Rubiaceae, they're related to coffee. And there's some really big genera here, such as Coprosma and Psychotria. If you go out in the native forest, these are some of the most common plants you'll find. And they occur in most habitat types. And the Urticaceae are another group that are nettles, except in Hawaii they're nettleless nettles because they've lost that defense mechanism. They're really kind of soft, squishy plants that Drosophila loves. And you can find these up in the cliff trail just behind us. All these things are up there, and they're very dominant. These are the dominant plant groups that Drosophila feeds on. And then there's plants, other plant groups here that they've sort of adapted to, but I'm going to skip over quite a bit of that. But going back to Kauai, so prior to the formation of the other islands, when Kauai was the only one there, these Drosophila just started to adapt to all the plants that were there, essentially. So all the plant groups that had arrived on Kauai, when these Drosophila got there, it just sort of started to spawn all these new species and lineages associated with the different plant groups. That includes the Urticaceae, so this was very early, and the Rubiaceae, the coffee relative, very early transition. So it makes sense that those would be the dominant plant groups because they were some of the first ones that these Drosophila adapted to. Also includes a couple of the Campanulaceae that the Drosophila feed on that are really old, so those were present on Kauai at that time period. And then Hydrangea is another one that's out there, but it's probably a little more recent, and a couple other groups. So as they diversified to these new plant groups, they also started to take on different morphological features, which is really kind of neat because this is a wet forest one, so a lot of those are darker, so they blend in more. Birds are probably feeding on them. These other ones are in open environments, so they take on different sort of morphologies, probably to hide from predation and also maybe for sexual selection. So after they did that, they basically colonized Oahu, and then at that point they just went on down the island chain. So once they established these plant lineages, they moved to Oahu, and then they just kind of went crazy as the islands started to form much faster down the group. And that includes adapting to 20 new plant families. Urticaceae is this one that they never went back to. So once they established their adaptation to a plant family, it's not like on Oahu or Hawaii Island they went back to feed on it. They just kept that ecological adaptation all the way down the island. So there isn't a lot of sort of back transitions. And as I was saying, as it turned out, these lineages that went down to Oahu and down on were actually defined by their host plants. And this is for all the groups that they feed on. It's a dominant pattern. Excuse me. So in essence, they were kind of surfing their host plants down to what we have now. But as I mentioned earlier, there were kind of some exceptions to the pattern where clades emerged more recently. And these clades are a lot younger, sort of the age of Maui. And one of the hypotheses we had was, okay, well, if this emerges now, it's probably because there's something new in the environment, maybe that they adapted to. And in this case, I'll focus in on this one. It turns out that this plant group, Dodonea, which is a soapberry relative here, some other group that was doing work on this plant estimated that it arrived about 1.2 million years ago. And we also estimated independently that these Persini transitioned over to it about 1.2 million years ago. So once this plant established on Hawaii, these Persini made fast work of it, and then it used that as a way to sort of spread back up the island chain as the plant went on, and to go down forward. And that's the case that we found for these other lineages too. So Pipterus is probably a relatively young plant group that's really widespread, transitioned later on in the island formation, so much more younger, and then went in different directions, aside from the progression. So as these new plant lineages have shown up, it kind of created more ecological opportunity for insects to expand their environment, essentially, and to get new species. So I want to put that together a little bit just to sort of show how this occurred through time. Because we have the phylogeny, and we know the Hawaiian Island ages, we can look at how species accumulated through time, and then whether or not there's been extinctions or when things started to slow down. So we were able, this is kind of a complex diagram, but we were able to put all these diversification events here in absolute time in millions of years, and then we can count the number of species that accumulated through time. And then we can use a number of modeling approaches to say, okay, when was this fastest, when was it slow, and when was it slowest? Or however many times there's statistically significant shift in the number of species that have arrived or are speciating in Hawaii. In this case, for Nisa Persini, using this point forward, we estimated that there were 2 periods where things just sort of slowed down. And that's statistically significant if you look at the chance that maybe you missed a lot of sampling, there's been a lot of extinction, we did a bunch of modeling for that. But 2 points where we estimate massive slowdown in the number of speciation events, or species accumulation. And these correspond to some really intriguing geological time periods in Hawaii. So this T1, this is right before the formation of the Big Island. So once they reach Maui and Maui fully formed, there's a huge slowdown in the number of speciation events. And they sort of taper off a little bit. And the next one that's statistically significant basically happened right at the end of the formation of the Big Island. So as the islands themselves have sort of slowed and filled and then stopped forming, speciation events in this group have slowed. So the Hawaiian island structure themselves present a really interesting sort of platform that shapes species, but then also kind of puts the brake on it too. So as the islands stop forming, species stop forming also. And by the time Maui had formed, most of the dominant plant lineages were here already. There's just a handful of things that I had shown you where they came a little bit more recently. But all the dominant ones, like the Campanilaceae and everything, was here. So there is a huge sort of drop in ability or opportunity to make new ecological species, basically. So they ran out of food, essentially, to adapt to at that point. And then once they get to the Big Island, that's the end of it. And for those of you who've been to the Big Island, that's quite literally the end of the Hawaiian Islands. And the lava is flowing, and there's not a lot of plant life that's surviving. So this is expected. This is just a sort of molten slab area. Sorry, hold on, just asking. I got a few more slides. I don't know if we're out of time.
You have a few more minutes, like 8 minutes, since we have to let these guys go.
Okay. I think I'll stop there. If anybody has any questions, we have a little bit. Yeah.
I had a question with the places. Was it specialist pollination relationship?
No, so these aren't pollinators. They're kind of, if you think of lice that feed on cats or dogs or you, these are kind of like plant lice. They may be a nuisance to the plants if they don't have any diseases that they carry or viruses. They just sort of suck the sap of plants and hang out, but they don't pollinate. So they're not, we don't know of any benefit they give to the plants exclusively. There's some hypotheses, but essentially no, not pollinators. Yeah.
Is there just one colonizing species of the group of leafhoppers that diversified into the 200 plus species?
Yep, they arrived once. Just one showed up. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And that's the case for most of these insect groups. One colonist arrives, and then you get this unbelievable diversification. And they've estimated that with insects, a colonization probably occurred once every 110,000 years. So not that frequent. And then because they don't keep coming, then you get this sort of diversification within the islands. Yeah.
Was your T1 the formation of Maui or the formation of the northwest part of Hawaii?
So that is this sort of gap here. There's a trench where this T1, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Maui's done forming at this point. And the point there is that also all the plants that exist, most of the plant lineages are already here too.
Okay.
And those, so the geography and the plants are kind of the drivers of diversification in this group. And at this point, basically the plants are done. They've colonized them, they've adapted to them. But then you get the Big Island, which is kind of a carbon copy of what you find a lot in Maui. So it just basically duplicated what you find here 5 or 6 times. Any other questions? Yeah.
So for the ancestral genus that arrived from the Western Pacific, is there comparable diversity among that group?
Yes. Well, no, it's tough. It's not really well known. There's a handful of widespread species, and then maybe there's 100 or so species that exist, but they're not described. That's just through conversations with other people. Leafhoppers tend to be really narrowly restricted in general. So some of the patterns we're finding here are patterns people have found sort of in the Yukon range, Canada and things like that. But because leafhoppers, they also have really wide ranges, they're not so well studied. This is one of the first times they were actually, okay, here's the origin of a leafhopper group, here's how the plant and geology sort of appreciated that group. Yeah.
Almost all the species single island endemics, or you said single volcano endemic?
Single volcano endemic, so it's even more restricted than single island. So yes, but then it's even sort of more narrow than that too. And it may even be more narrow than that. I mean, we could study this for another 10 years. Like with the Mecyclothorax beetles I showed you originally, they're finding 110 species on just one part of an island. And basically the hypothesis for those are that all the ridges, they don't really make it across the ridges. So when islands are eroding and they get this really complex formation of sort of ridges and valleys, unique species are on the ridges. So they're dividing the habitat in a really fine scale. But only a couple groups have been looked at like that.
All right, let's thank Dr. Bennett for